And Scott Horton is the director of the Libertarian Institute, the editorial director of antiwar.com, and the author of this book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. Mr. Horton, it's 20 years since 9/11 and U.S. troops in Afghanistan. What's your reflection on that?
Well, as far as just the war in Afghanistan goes, we never should have fought it. The whole war on terrorism really should have been and could have been over by Christmas 2001 if the W. Bush administration had focused their efforts on either the extradition of al-Qaeda to America or another friendly country, or on targeting the guilty, the very small number of al-Qaeda fighters who are hiding out in Afghanistan. Instead, he wrote a writ for regime change against the Taliban in Kabul that did not attack us, and then to wage a 20-year war against all of its enemies in an attempt to prop that new government up. And now after 20 years, they've admitted what's been true for at least 10, which is that the war is lost and the Taliban has won. And they never could have won that war. And now the proof is in the pudding, that the critics were right all along and the proponents were wrong.
So 20 years later, the U.S. is pulling out of Afghanistan. What do you think the results will be?
Well, I think it's going to be real trouble for the parties that America has supported in power for all this time. In Iraq War II, America fought for the supermajority. So it wasn't really a victory because they didn't need us and kicked America right out as soon as we were done winning the war for them. But the government America created in Baghdad is still the government of Iraq. In Afghanistan, the situation is different. We've essentially been attempting to foist a coalition of minorities on the plurality of the country. The 40% of the population are the Pashtuns, and they've had essentially no political representation in the government and have been sworn to resist American occupation since they really started fighting again back in about 2004, 2005. And so they are going to take over the country almost certainly, and that means that there's going to be hell to pay for those who have been propped up in power by the United States so far. And it would be great if they could negotiate some kind of peaceful resolution to the problem in the form of a new government there. But frankly, I do expect the worst.
In your book, Enough Already, you describe 9/11 as blowback. What do you mean by that?
Well, blowback was a term coined by the Central Intelligence Agency after the coup in Iran in 1953. And it means not just consequences, but it means long-term consequences of secret foreign policies. So that when they come back to haunt the United States, the American people don't understand the real context of what's going on. It's like with the Iranian Revolution of 1979 and the Ayatollah calling us the Great Satan and burning the American flag. The American people didn't know that the CIA had overthrown the government of Iran 25 years before, and that this was the consequence of that. It was the same kind of thing. In fact, that same year, 1979, Jimmy Carter, on July 3rd, signed a finding authorizing the CIA to start backing the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in an attempt to provoke the Soviets into invading that country. In the words of the Carter administration at the time, the purpose of this was to give the Soviets their own Vietnam, a hopeless, long-term, no-win war that breaks the bank and destabilizes the country. And we did that. And then through the Reagan years, this policy continued on, and it included not just backing the Afghan Mujahideen, but tens of thousands of what were called the Arab Afghans, the army of not just Arabs, but actually Muslims from Chechnya, the Philippines, the United States, and especially the Middle East, who all traveled to Afghanistan to help fight against the Soviet Union. Then when America permanently occupied Saudi Arabia in preparation for Iraq War I, and then permanently throughout the 1990s and the rest of the 20th century, and continued to bomb Iraq from those bases in Saudi Arabia, that was what caused Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri and their group to turn against their former patrons, the United States of America. And it was first and foremost, the bases in Saudi used to bomb Iraq and the no-fly zones throughout the 1990s, support for Israel and their occupation of Palestine and at that time of Lebanon, support for dictators around the Middle East, such as the king in Saudi Arabia and at that time El Presidente Mubarak in Egypt, pressure on those nations to keep production high and oil prices artificially low to subsidize our economy at their expense. And bin Laden criticized America for turning a blind eye to Russia, China, and India and Uzbekistan for their wars and suppression of Muslims. And what's interesting about that is that actually the Bill Clinton government supported the al-Qaeda forces and al-Qaeda linked forces in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and in Chechnya, even though they had been attacking us all through the 1990s. And America's, in fact, picking up the tabs for Russia's war against the Chechen rebels at the same time that the CIA and the Saudis were backing the Chechen rebels against them. And in fact, after September 11th, Bill Clinton, Tom Lantos, and Brad Sherman, all three said something to the effect of, how could these Muslims attack us after all we've done for them lately? But the reality was that the occupation of Saudi Arabia had not ceased, the bombing of Iraq had not ceased, support for Israel and the dictatorships in the Middle East had not ceased. So the Democrats had failed to bribe off these al-Qaeda terrorists. All their motives to attack the United States were still on. And importantly, it wasn't just that they were angry about these policies, they had a strategy. And the strategy was to provoke the United States into doing something stupid. As Saul Alinsky wrote in Rules for Radicals, in all asymmetric political action, including terrorism, the action is in the reaction of the opposition. In this case, al-Qaeda they weren't trying to get America to just turn around and run away. They didn't think that that would work. They were trying to provoke a full-scale invasion of Afghanistan so they could replicate the war that we had helped them fight against the Soviets in the 1980s, to bog us down and, in bin Laden's words, bleed us to bankruptcy and force the American empire out the long way and the hard way. And in fact, Osama bin Laden's son Omar gave an interview to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010 when bin Laden was still alive. And he said that when Bush won the election of 2000, he said, "My father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs, one who will attack and break the country." And so he said, in Clinton's time, you sent cruise missiles after my father and he got away. But then again, you've been in Afghanistan for 10 years and you still don't have him. In Clinton's time, America was smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. And this is a very important point because Bret Stephens from the New York Times, for example, just a couple of months ago, wrote an article criticizing withdrawal from Afghanistan and citing bin Laden's taunts that America's a paper tiger. They'll turn around and run away if we just give them a truck bombing or two. And Bret Stephens, one of the leading opinion writers at the New York Times, the newspaper of record in America, says that this is proof that America must stay and continue to double and triple down forever and ever. When these were simple taunts by bin Laden, because that's exactly the reaction they were trying to get out of Bret Stephens and the American establishment, that America needs to stay at war until we literally can't anymore, because our dollar is completely destroyed and our empire is completely broken, like what happened to the Soviet Union.
Well, the subtitle of your book is Time to End the War on Terrorism. How do you define that war, and what date do you see it starting?
Well, the real war on terrorism began in 2001 after September 11th. And of course, the CIA had efforts against al-Qaeda around the Middle East in the years leading up to that. But, you know, in essence, the war on terrorism has been a bait and switch. From the very beginning, the Bush government conflated al-Qaeda with the Taliban, who not only had not attacked us, but sent their foreign minister, Watakil, to warn the Americans of an impending attack. And then from there, they immediately conflated bin Laden and his group of radicals with Saddam Hussein, the secular, essentially atheist dictator of Iraq, a land where there were no al-Qaeda members, where there had never been a suicide bombing in the entire history of the country. And they used the fear of terrorism and the fear of a completely phony and fake and dishonestly claimed alliance between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden to essentially lie the people of the United States into that war. And from there, and by the way, the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit said that if Afghanistan was all that bin Laden ever wanted, then America going to Iraq to attack what bin Laden called the socialist infidel, Saddam Hussein, was the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden. And by taking the side of the Shiites there, America drove the Sunni minority population of the country into the arms of the bin Ladenites. And their ranks swelled from 400 men at the time of the September 11th attack to tens of thousands during that war. And then luckily, the local Sunni tribal leaders marginalized al-Qaeda in 2006 and 2007 and solved that problem for us to a great degree. But then, just at the time that Barack Obama was killing Osama bin Laden in Pakistan in the spring of 2001, he was taking his side in Libya and then in Syria. And so the Libyans and Syrians who had gone to Iraq to fight with al-Qaeda in Iraq against the United States and Shiite forces there had now come home, just as bin Laden and them had come home from the 1980s war in Afghanistan to cause trouble. These guys came to start a revolution in Libya. The Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, Ansar al-Sharia, al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, these guys fought under Zarqawi in Iraq War II. And Obama took their side in a 9-month air war and special operations war to overthrow Gaddafi, who was murdered on the side of the road. And the country, of course, was plunged into absolute turmoil and violence and civil war that's been raging ever since that time. And then they took the jihadists and the guns off and shipped them off to Syria for the next regime change. And as Barack Obama explained to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic in 2012, when Goldberg said, you know, the Iraq war has empowered Iran. Don't you think if we got rid of Assad in Syria that would help bring Iran down a peg? And Obama says, absolutely. And Jeffrey Goldberg says, well, what more can be done to see this through, to make it happen sooner? And Obama says essentially the old line about, I'd tell you, but I'd have to kill you. He says, I can't tell you, Jeffrey, because your classified clearance isn't high enough. And what he meant by that was the United States had already launched a covert action campaign in coordination with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, Jordan, and Israel to support al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. They called them moderate rebels, but they were nothing but the head chopper, suicide bomber enemies from Iraq War II. And so that war ended up leading, as John Kerry explained in a secretly recorded discussion with Syrian rebels, it led to the al-Qaeda forces and ISIS, which split off from al-Qaeda, deciding not to march west to Damascus, but instead to go east and conquer all of Western Iraq, leading to the Islamic Caliphate, which in the days of George W. Bush was the wildest war propaganda of liars like Glenn Beck, who said, there's an Islamo-fascist caliphate out there that's coming to get us, when there were nothing but nation states in the way. There was no caliphate anywhere. And this was Osama bin Laden's wildest dream, hiding in the attic in Abbottabad, Pakistan. And yet, with Bush's war in Iraq and Obama's war in Syria, they succeeded in the impossible, creating a literal bin Ladenite Islamo-fascist caliphate, as they called it, for 3 years, from 2014 through 17. The size of land, the size of Great Britain, with tens of thousands of conscripts in their army, and leading to Iraq War III, and total casualties in Iraq and Syria of certainly more than 500,000. And they've done the same thing with the bait and switch down in Yemen, where Barack Obama had a war beginning in 2009, a CIA and Air Force drone war against al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Not just al-Qaeda-tied actors, but real al-Qaeda terrorists, guys who had helped coordinate September 11th, who had bombed the USS Cole in 2000, who did the underpants bombing, attempting to blow up a plane over Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. And Obama was bombing them. But then, and I'll skip the politics because it's a complicated mess, but by the end of 2014, a Shiite group friendly with Iran called the Houthis came out of the north and sacked the capital city. Well, at the time that happened, and you can all read this in the Wall Street Journal and a great piece by Barbara Slavin in Al Monitor from January 2015, our current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was a 4-star general, the commander of CENTCOM, and he made a deal with the Houthis. Hey, you guys like killing al-Qaeda? No problem. And he was funneling them intelligence to use to target and kill al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That was January 2015. Just 2 months later, Barack Obama stabbed the Houthis in the back and took Al-Qaeda's side against them in the war launched by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and their allies, including the United States, which has helped with the war from the very beginning. Obama gave the green light for them to begin it. And Al-Qaeda has been a major part of the coalition this whole time. CNN did a story a couple of years ago about how the UAE had given Al-Qaeda guys American MRAP, armored personnel carriers, that they were using not just to drive around and enjoy ride in, but were taking into battle. And after Al-Qaeda had seized the port town of Makalla and a couple of others, this was really embarrassing for the coalition. And so the UAE made a deal with them that they would integrate them into their militia. And so the Obama and the Trump governments, and now into Biden, pretend that they still have a war against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, but that's just not true. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula have been integrated into the UAE's armed militia force on the ground. The Americans are flying as air cover and acting as part of the coalition with the bin Ladenites against their enemies, the Houthis, just because the Houthis are friends with Iran. So, even though it was the bin Ladenites that hit the towers, not Iran and not their allies in Hezbollah or any other group that did it.
So, Scott Horton, you might see this as a false question, but how do we protect American interests abroad if we end the war on terror?
Well, the first thing we should do is stop supporting terrorist groups. You know, they say we can't leave Afghanistan because we'll leave a safe haven behind. But our government, through the Turks, still supports Al-Qaeda in Syria, still supports in this war, this horrific war of, frankly, genocidal proportions against the civilian population of Yemen. And we continue to target with brutal sanctions the Iranian and Syrian regimes that are at the top of the bin Ladenites lists. So the first thing for regime change themselves. So the first thing we should do is stop supporting terrorism. And then as far as the threat of further anti-American terrorism, we have to call off the entire policy of American dominance of the Middle East. That is the cause of the terrorism problem against the United States in the first place. And so just ending the war on terrorism won't do, because then we will still be at risk. What has to happen is the middle part of North America has to renounce their pretended mandate to rule the rest of the world, and particularly the Arab Middle East now.
Scott Horton is the author of this book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. He is also the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of Antiwar.com, which is what, Mr. Horton?
Antiwar.com is the most important project on the internet. We've been around for 25 years, write about everything the whole time, and the records prove it. We're libertarian, non-interventionist, but we are very Catholic in our organization, and we feature all of the best writers from the left and right and around the world, and anyone as long as it's on strict non-interventionist foreign policy. We have the best news writers, the best columnists. It is absolutely the most important project on the internet today.
So just to extrapolate a little bit, we've been talking about the war on terror, but do you think that American forces should be brought back from Korea? Should the U.S. have international bases?
No. And in fact, you know, our Constitution describes a limited republic rather than a world empire. There is no threat in Korea or Japan or in Europe for that matter. And the only reason the Americans obstruct reunification in Korea is because they want to be able to hold the North Korean threat as blackmail over South Korea and Japan to let us keep our troops there. But if we just let the South Koreans drive, they would reunify. They would make a deal and reunify with the North if the Americans would cease preventing it. And as far as Europe goes, look at what's going on right now with the controversy, where Biden supposedly is in trouble now for obstructing Germany and Russia from creating this natural gas pipeline, the Nord Stream pipeline. Now, your audience is familiar with the fact that the last two times Germany and Russia fought, it was the worst thing that had ever happened. And now we have the Germans who, as Donald Trump complained, refuse to spend 2% of GDP on their military. and in fact are building a pipeline with the Russians to expand trade and economic interdependence with them. And that's because Angela Merkel and her government do not believe the Russians are coming. And the reason why is because the Russians aren't coming. The Soviet Union has been dead and gone for 30 years. America has expanded NATO all the way up to their borders in the Baltic states and have threatened perennially to even bring Ukraine and Georgia into NATO. It is the United States and our world empire that are the aggressors and the destabilizers in Eastern Europe. And if we would just spot out, things there would be much better.
Scott Horton has joined us from Freedom Fest, the annual libertarian convention being held in Rapid City, South Dakota this year. His book, Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. Mr. Horton, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Peter.